They called her a young Einstein. She was a Yale graduate student, photogenic, glamorous, with a wonderful career ahead of her. On a Tuesday morning in September 2009, she walked into a building on Yale University Campus and she disappeared. Her mobile phone, her wallet were still in the office, yet there was no trace of her anywhere. And then the American media, then the international media got involved with the case. But still, no one could find her. Welcome to Crime Waves. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Crime Waves. My name is Declan Hill, and each week myself and the producers, and this week it's Eric Krebs, Ryan Decker, and Aidan Van Battenberg, take a look at famous criminal cases through the eyes of the investigators. And in this season, we're examining the question, how to catch a killer. What are the techniques used by the detectives to bring about a successful solution? And this week, it's a tragedy of a case. An intelligent, attractive young woman disappears. The media gets involved. 4 different police agencies get involved. And in the midst of all the controversy and pressure, the officials hand the case to this week's guest. Lisa Dadio is now a professor at the Henry C. Lee College of Criminal Justice at the University of New Haven. But then she was the head of the Major Crimes Unit of the New Haven Police Force. And she'd just been given the biggest professional challenge of her life. Now, she'll come on and talk about that, but a note to all our listeners. After we finished this interview, we listened and discovered that the sound quality is actually not very good. We want to apologize to you, but you'll hear, such as the emotion shown by Lisa Dadio during the interview, we didn't want to ask her to repeat it. So accept our apologies, but we think you'll understand. Good morning, Lisa. Thank you so much for coming on Crime Waves.
Thank you.
Hey, listen, our tagline on everything we do is crimewavespodcast.com. Come meet the best investigators in the world. And you are definitely one of those best investigators in the world. The case we're going to be talking about this morning, Lisa, is one that you cracked. It was one that had international attention around the world. People were following this one. It was an ultimate locked room murder mystery. But I want to start with the focus on a couple of quotes. And these are from the parents of the victim. Years after you finished your work, they came forward and said, "Our pain remains fresh, changing every aspect of life within our family." And the mother said, "You took away my only daughter, Annie. I will never hold my grandchildren." And I want to start by that, listeners, because a lot of times in these crime junkie podcasts, people forget that there was actually real humans at the center of these murder cases. And the case that we're looking at today is Annie Lay, a brilliant young Yale University graduate student who was murdered. Lisa, tell us about that case. How did you get involved with it, please?
Okay. Thank you again, Declan, for inviting me to be part of this podcast and just to have the opportunity to speak about this case and the impact it had on all of us that worked it. Just like every death does, to be quite honest with you. I mean, we're all impacted as investigators because you want to solve the case and you want to give closure to the victim's family and friends and coworkers. This case definitely tugged incredibly hard on all of us for a lot of reasons. One of which was when we were first brought into this case, it came in as a missing person case. And it just so happened that, Annie had gone, quote, missing a few days before her wedding. So we were all up against this a lot of things, a lot of emotions, right? And nobody thought initially when Annie's roommate reported her missing at about 10:30 at night that we would be a couple days later investigating this as a homicide.
Give our
We
listeners some background. I mean, we know this. It's New Haven,
Yeah.
it's a famous case, but it's September. It's early September 2009. So talk us through who Annie Lay was and the circumstances, please.
Okay, great. Yes, sorry. So Annie was a graduate student at Yale University. Brilliant. She had been awarded a multi-million dollar research grant to do work on, believe it or not, the impact of fast food on humans, but utilizing mice, for example. She came to Yale University having done incredible amount of work from her undergrad university up in New York, which is where she actually met her fiance, Jonathan, and then decided to pursue and continue her education as a graduate student at the prestigious Yale University. She, by all intents and purposes, and from friends and colleagues and her research advisor and everybody that knew Annie, was this incredibly brilliant, bright, positive, outgoing individual.
They called
And
her at one point. I saw an article describing her. If there was going to be an Einstein of our generation, she was going to be it. I mean, she just had it.
yeah, and that's exactly what everybody's like. If anyone was going to have an impact, it was going to be her in regards to, medical research in her particular case, and just the way that the type of person she was, and the way that her brain was, and her passion in research in order to apply it to the country and to health and ways of looking at how things are impacted one way or the other. So, she came to New Haven, Connecticut to continue doing amazing work in really the medical field per se. And, she, on the day that she disappeared, was going into her lab to check on her mice.
Before she was going to go off and get married. Lisa, tell us about the chronology. I mean, that's one of the key investigation techniques. So
Yeah,
it's
I mean,
early in the morning, Tuesday, September the 8th. Walk
yep.
us through what happens.
So early in the morning on September 8th, Annie leaves her apartment. She takes public transportation. She goes to her office in one of the Yale buildings near 10 Amistad, which is the research laboratory. We know she goes into her office, drops off some items, grabs some items, and then walks over to the research laboratory at 10 Amistad. We actually see her go into the building. We see what she's wearing. We see her carrying what we believe is her lab notebook. And this all becomes important. And I'll talk about it later, how we know all this and why we're looking at all this. And she goes into the building. We see her go in, and then that's it. We don't see her again until days later. So what happens is that same day, there's a fire alarm at 10 Amistad, and the whole building is evacuated. And there's numerous entrances and exits that are all recorded, and there's cameras there utilizing CCTV. And what we find is that she never leaves. But again, we don't know this initially.
And how are you figuring this out? I mean, you obviously weren't watching her then. When you talk about seeing her and that, what are you using?
So what happens after we start looking into this incident, right, on the evening of September 8th, is we start having personnel combing through hours and hours and hours of recorded footage of every single entrance and exit to 10 Amistad. And they're looking to see if we can see anyone fitting the description of Annie. Sometimes some of the images are in color, some are in black and white. Black and white obviously causes a little more of a challenge for anyone reviewing it because it's difficult to see, for example, the color of her clothing, right? Which is what we were going by as well. So we started combing through hours from the minute that she walked into that building till days later, seeing if she ever left.
So when is the last time you're able to see her image on one of those closed circuit TV? What time is that?
It's around, I think it was around between 10 and 10:30, the morning of September 8th is the last time that we see Annie on any images whatsoever.
And so she's walked into a medical research lab where she's doing this multi-million dollar, medical research. We see her walking in. Are we able to use her key card access?
Yes. So again, this was something that we had started to look at once we were into this and treating this investigation differently, is we were able to see that she key carded into her lab space within a couple minutes after she seen walking into 10 Amistad. And where that becomes incredibly important is once she key cards into her lab, it's truly just hers, her laboratory space where her research is being conducted. She's never key carded anywhere else in the building any time after that. Only that one time that she key carded in. So, that became important for us because there's no way to move around in that building without using your key card.
We're going to jump ahead. It's now 10:30 at night, Tuesday, September the 8th, 2009, and her roommate says, "Now, this is something wrong. Annie hasn't come home." What does she do, and what's the reaction?
So, being that Annie is a Yale University student, her roommate, who's also a Yale University student, calls Yale University Police Department to report Annie as missing. It's not like Annie to not come home to check in, and nobody had heard from Annie in several hours. So, everyone obviously starts becoming alarmed because it's just so uncharacteristic of the type of person that she was. And especially she was expected home a few hours beforehand and never came home because she was going to be leaving the following day in preparation for her wedding that weekend. So her roommate contacted Yale University Police Department. They responded to Annie's apartment to speak with the roommate. They got as much information as they can, and then they started backtracking and looking in their own internal system for her key card access and, knowing where she went and wanted to make sure that she wasn't working late in her office, which was away from 10 Amistad. And so they went to her office where they found her cell phone. They found some personal items, which again, maybe it was important, but at the same time, you're thinking, oh, she must have just dropped her cell phone there knowing she'd be back in a couple minutes and not thinking anything of it. And they went and they, checked her office, and then they went and checked her lab over at 10 Amistad, and Annie wasn't there. And so then Yale were treating it as a missing person. Maybe she got a little jittery. Maybe she, was having second thoughts about her upcoming wedding, which was a big thing at that time, actually, because we had
Quote,
several
runaway
Yes.
bride thing.
Yes, we had several runaway bride cases that had happened. Not we, meaning Connecticut, but throughout the country, we were having this. I don't want to call it a phenomenon because that's not what it is, but we were having this occurrence where women were, panicking at the last minute of getting married, and they would run away.
Yes.
And step away from their wedding. And so
I think there was even a movie at that time about that kind of thing.
There was a movie that had come out. Yeah.
So at first people are thinking maybe this has happened to Annie, or what was the other theory that people were thinking about?
They actually were thinking about maybe she had been kidnapped,
Wow.
to be quite honest with you. And there was that theory that had come out that, being that Annie was Asian and Jonathan was not, that this was a family cultural thing, that the family didn't want her to marry outside of her culture. And again, early on, you're looking at every possible avenue as to what happened to this person. No one just disappears in thin air, which is what it appeared to happen initially in this case.
And so Wednesday, September the 9th, the FBI is brought in. Why are those guys brought in and not you guys?
So Wednesday morning, I was actually contacted by one of the detective sergeants at Yale University asking for some resources. And at the time, I was in command of the major crime unit, and one of the units underneath me was missing persons. And so they had requested some assistance interviewing people and that kind of thing. So we had provided a sergeant and two detectives to assist with the missing persons. The sergeant then had also informed me that they had contacted the FBI because they were concerned that this may be a kidnapping case. And if that was the case and someone's brought over state lines, it becomes a federal offense. So Yale had contacted the field office in New Haven, the FBI field office in New Haven, to assist in this investigation as well, thinking maybe we had a possible kidnapping involved because Annie literally disappeared. Nobody had heard from her. There was no usage on her credit cards. Her cell phone was back in her office. So that's why the FBI was brought in literally in under 24 hours later.
Wow. Now, there's a fire alarm that happens.
Yes.
So the last time anyone has seen Annie on a camera, on a, one of those building cameras, security cameras, is around 10 o'clock a.m. Tuesday, September 9th, 2009.
September 8th.
Excuse me, yep. September 8th. What happens at 1 o'clock, and why does that, what role does that play in the investigation?
Okay. So, again, with every investigation, as you're going through it, things are evolving. The more you look at things, the more you dig kind of into everything. On September 8th, when Annie had gone missing, there was a fire alarm. One of the pieces of equipment actually in the research laboratory that had it had malfunctioned, and it's a steam vent type of thing, and so it set off a fire alarm. The entire building had to vacate, everybody. And so what became important after we're looking at all this footage and literally combing through, numerous cameras being recorded for days later, was that Annie never left the building during that fire alarm. She's not shown on any single camera whatsoever leaving. So it gave us a time frame in this particular case on, okay, we know she key carded in 10:30, fire alarms around 1 o'clock or so, and she doesn't leave. So it's like, well, where is she? What happened to her between when she key carded in and when this fire alarm took place? Because we know with 100% certainty she did not leave that building.
Now, that's anticipating the investigation Wednesday, the investigation Thursday, the investigation Friday by Yale Police Department and the FBI with some help from the Connecticut State Police. But you're basically as the New Haven guys, the New Haven cops, and this is one of these weird multi-jurisdictional cases where there's umpteen different police forces. You're kind of having to be on the sidelines. At the same time, the media is going nuts. For some reason, they're just like going crazy on this. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. So, you raised a couple incredible points there regarding this investigation. It was truly multi-jurisdictional. You had Yale University Police Department, you had the FBI. They were initially the two agencies involved. And then the Connecticut State Police got involved, and then New Haven Police Department got fully involved and took over the investigation, all within a few days. Initially, it was good. It was a missing person case, right? Nothing happened, no media attention. Yale students, not just Yale students, people go missing all the time. Well, as this went on, this became an international media circus, is the only way to describe it. Every outlet you could imagine, every news and media outlet you can imagine was camped out at the police department. The New Haven Police Department, that is, were camped out as close as they can get to 10 Amistad because Yale had released a missing person bulletin and pamphlet and posters, and then started appealing to the media as well. If anyone had seen, Annie, and we had images of what she was wearing that day, so we knew what she was wearing, and those went on the posters to please contact police. So, for nonstop 24/7 up until an arrest was made, all of these locations and others, of course, Yale had the media sleeping out. They were literally intense all over the place,
it was
sleeping
weird.
and in
One of
trailers.
our producer, Eric Krebs, found this fantastic Pew study analysis of the media that week. And this particular case had as much attention as policy decisions from President Barack Obama. I mean, it was massively national and international news, the disappearance of this one particular person. Because at that moment, it's still the last camera shot is between 10 and 10:30.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody leaves the building at 1 o'clock. Your law enforcement colleagues are combing through the archival footage, not seeing anybody leave. So you've got a classic locked room disappearance.
Correct.
It's now Saturday, September 12th, and there's a briefing at the FBI headquarters on State Street here in New Haven, and they hand this multi-jurisdictional investigation to you, Lisa Dadio, personally, as head of major crimes. Why did they do that? What's all the dynamics happening there?
So, we now know at this point that we're dealing with something bigger than a missing person case. And evidence had been found prior to Saturday, September 12th, that would lead investigators to
tell us
believe
what that evidence was, please.
So initially in the lab room of Annie, on a cart was a box of what's called white balls, paper towels per se. And there was actually, typically we would say a reddish brown in color stain on it. That's the correct term to say until it's tested. But there was a blood swipe on the box itself. And enough blood that it alerted one of the officers that was securing that area to pay attention to it. And so with that and with some other things that started to pan out, if you would, or to be brought to light, they decided that we needed to start treating this something other than a missing person case, and that something bad had happened to Annie. And so on September 12th, we had this meeting, and all the heads of every agency were there. The FBI, the Connecticut State Police, the New Haven Police Department, Yale University, the state's attorney's office, the chief state's attorney's office, not the chief state's attorney, the U.S. attorney's office, for the feds about this case. And when you're dealing with a homicide.
Outside.
Yeah.
The media, international, national, is camped.
Yeah.
So they look around the room and they say, Lisa Dadio, you're in charge. Yes.
Yeah.
Go find this, clear this mystery up.
Yeah. And coordinate it with literally hundreds and hundreds of federal agents, Connecticut state troopers, New Haven police officers, Yale University PD, go ahead and solve this case and good luck. Right. And so, we got involved with it as a homicide investigation, days after she went missing. And so now we're playing catch up from an investigative standpoint, right? Now we have to kind of get brought up to speed as to what was done, who did what, who was interviewed, and then we're dealt with this days later. And, it was intense. But yet, I have to tell you, everybody bent over backwards and was incredibly forthcoming with everything that had been done. And we set up a room at the FBI where on all the walls that you can imagine, there wasn't an inch of open space. We had put up paper and we're documenting everything and kind of what we had done, what we still need to do, because it was just so massive and so many different agencies were doing different things. We had to reel all that in. and become more focused as to, okay, let's solve this. Let's figure out where she is. We still didn't know where she is. And now we're on, what, day 4, day 5?
You're also
And
getting in all these phone calls because the media
uh,
stuff is so. Tell us a little bit about that.
yeah, so the information that was coming in was nonstop, which was great because, again, having so many different agencies involved, our resources were tripled and quadrupled. So we started to assign people just to follow up on the calls that were coming in. People who thought they saw Annie in New Haven. We had to follow up on those because what happens if, in fact, she was found and somebody did see her? And then, combing through additional video footage throughout the city to make sure that it wasn't her. And so, again, thankfully, because of how many different agencies were involved, we were able to give people certain assignments to do where us, New Haven, the major crime division focused in on finding her and identifying who was responsible for her
And at one point,
disappearance.
again, because you're dealing with a closed, locked room mystery, at one point, you assigned a bunch of detectives to start checking the garbage. Tell us about that and why you did that.
So, based upon the video footage, we knew that she didn't walk out of the building. So then it came down to how did she leave? Thinking that, and again, remember, this is a research facility. We were able to get how frequent they emptied the garbage there. Both Yale University, their facilities department, and private, emptying dumpsters, for example. And so we had to assign, and it was Connecticut State Troopers and the FBI to track down the garbage and where it went and how often since, September 8th was the garbage emptied. And is it possible that somebody could have gone out with the garbage somewhere? And, we actually had to, we assigned troopers and FBI agents to trash.
She was quite a light woman, was she not? Man, being quite small.
Yeah, and I don't even think she hit 5 feet. So it would have been easy for her to, and this is going to sound so cold and callous, but to be discarded like trash because she was so small. And so, we had to look at that avenue because we're like, nobody just disappears. And honestly, we thought she had to have gone out with the trash, right? Because how else? She wasn't in the building. We didn't physically see her. She wasn't in any of the rooms. All the rooms were checked. Like there was no evidence of her that we found initially prior to September 12th.
And so now it's the evening of Saturday, September 12th. It's the beginning of these 21 days that you pull off 10 or 15 of these in a row. What happens at the investigation?
Odors of decomposition. And when I tell you that there's nothing in this world that smells like human decomposition, there truly is nothing. Animals that are decomposing don't smell like it. Only humans do. So that smell is very distinctive to everybody, and we start smelling.
We're talking about people like yourself who are major crime investigators. You've smelt this before, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could be hundreds of feet away and you get a whiff of decomposition. There's a human body somewhere. So we get it. The problem is we're dealing with this major building that has a multi-million-dollar ventilation system. And the fact that we're smelling it is like, she's here. And it's like, now where is she? Canines, cadaver dogs were brought in from the Connecticut State Police again. And a cadaver dog actually alerts to a wall in a bathroom, mechanical, that type of thing, which is just unbelievable. That the dog alerted to that, and B, that we now are like, how the heck is a body in a wall? And I'll fast forward a little bit. Sure enough, we removed, and there was like, we call it a mechanical bat. It's a metal piece that's on a wall in a lot of commercial, or in this case, private universities, where, if you need to get to pipes or something in a wall, you kind of go into this. So we remove the vat, or this metal that's covering it. And lo and behold, you saw Annie's body, her lifeless body in the wall.
Awful.
Horrible. Absolutely horrible.
And the awful irony was that was the day that she was supposed to get married.
It was actually the night before that we found her. She was removed because of the time the following day, which was, she was found, and we started figuring out how we're going to do this in the wee hours type of thing. So yeah, she actually was theoretically recovered on the day that she was supposed to get married.
Awful. And I note that you're a detective with vast experience in this thing, and you're still moved as we're speaking about this. However, you had a problem because you've got this corpse of this beautiful young woman, but it's a crime scene, but it's in a wall. You've got a whole bunch of technical issues. Talk us through those technical issues as a detective, not as Lisa Dadio, the person who was still moved by this, but as a police officer. What are you thinking?
So as a police officer, we're thinking, how can we remove this body without contaminating any evidence that's on the body, any evidence that's contained within the wall? How can we do this as minimally intrusive as possible? And the decision was made to actually take out the wall. Not the wall where the mechanical vat was, but the opposite wall that was in kind of like this little closet area. We had made the determination to slowly and methodically, and as best as we could, to remove it piece by piece in order to get to the body. And so that's, in fact, what we did. The Connecticut State Police, one of their crime scene divisions, their major crime divisions is actually what they're called, are the ones who were tasked with processing the scene. So they were the ones who came up with an incredible strategy and plan on how to do this in the best way possible, and documenting every single step of the way with photography and with notes, which are all part of what is required for a crime scene investigation anyway.
Because you never know if you're going to get some smart defense lawyer who's able to invalidate an entire investigation because of just a little bit of contamination on that crime scene.
Exactly. And you know what it is too? We didn't want to destroy any evidence that may be on the body or in the wall. So here we are, we want to get her out of there, obviously. And yet at the same time, not destroy anything that can help us with the who, and help us, identify the who, and help us, get a conviction once we identify a who. And so at the same time, trying to keep all that in the forefront of our brain, and yet obviously get her out of the wall.
And be respectful and be honorable.
Yeah. Yeah, it was terrible. I mean, just the whole thing is just, you're sitting there and you're like, how the heck does a human body get into a wall? And it's hard to picture, but she was so small that it was obvious and easy for that to happen. And yet, she was kind of, upside down in the wall, and it just,
so you've
difficult.
got, and again, I want to, it's really striking. You're a tough investigator, and you're still moved, a decade later by this. But you've got a problem at this point. It's now Sunday, September the 13th. What had been at first a missing persons case is now clearly a homicide. You've got a body of this previously brilliant young woman, but you don't know who did it. She's clearly being murdered. But so how did you go about that investigation?
So prior to New Haven getting involved with the criminal investigation, the Yale University and the FBI started interviewing people who had left. And I want to say the following day, they had actually interviewed the lab technician that was assigned to Annie's room. And asking if he had seen her the day before and all of that. And his name is Raymond Clark. And so he's like, oh yeah, I saw her, and yeah, she was, in doing checking on her mice, and she had her lunch with her, and she was leaving to go to lunch. And there was a time that he had provided. I want to say it was like 12:30, which was interesting because the fire alarm went off at around 1 o'clock, and we know she didn't leave the building. But yet now we know that he was the last one to see her, both based upon her key card access, which was non-existent after she key carded in her room. And then we knew that, prior to right around 1 o'clock when the alarm went off, she didn't leave. But yet Ray Clark just says, oh yeah, she left and had her lunch with her and she was going to lunch. So major red flag for a lot of reasons initially. And they actually talked to Ray and they interview Ray after the fact. And they, meaning the FBI, again, missing person case, not thinking homicide, not thinking kidnapping, not thinking anything, but we now have a time frame when somebody last see her alive, even though subsequently later we know all of that is not true, right? And so, because at the time that he's telling the investigators this, we haven't started combing through all of the footage. We started it, but there's so many cameras and so many hours that we're just beginning that analysis. And at the time, there was only one person doing it. We assigned other people to do it after to assist in that. But we now have a time frame. So we now think at 12:30 she left to go, to lunch somewhere.
Tell me, and our listeners, tell us about the green pen. What is the significance of the green pen?
So as I mentioned when I was talking about Annie's body in the wall, and evidence that was in there, both, and we're looking at all types of evidence: trace evidence, hairs, fibers, biological evidence, DNA. When we remove her body, on the floor area of the wall was a green pen. And why that becomes important is because, believe it or not, in addition to obviously all the key card access that you needed, there were also handwritten kind of not inventory sheets, but check-in sheets that you checked this area, that it was clean, this kind of thing. So Ray Clark had actually used the green pen. Now, how many of us have green pens, right? Not too many. We have black, we have blue, we have red, but how many of us have green inked pens? And this was a green ink pen. And so Ray had signed in prior with this green pen on this kind of, this room is clean sheet type of thing. And then later he signs in again and he's no longer using a green pen. He, in fact, I believe it was black. It was a black pen that he used. And it's like, and yet we find a green pen in the wall with her body. And so, obviously we seize it, we have analysis done, and sure enough, Ray's DNA comes back in the pen, as does Annie's. Again, we don't have that information immediately, but we have it pretty early on in the investigation, which became part of a key part when we started putting this case together to prepare an arrest warrant. We put in all about the pen.
When do you serve that arrest? When do you go in and make that arrest?
I want to say, I think, and I apologize, I think it was about 2 days after, maybe 3 days after Annie was removed from the wall. We had actually served that arrest warrant.
Wow.
You had
That's
mentioned
incredibly fast.
us.
That's like within 72 hours. You had wrapped up this major
Yeah.
case. They brought you in Saturday morning, and by Wednesday, Thursday, you had arrested the guy who eventually we find out did it.
Yes, that is true. And again, it was work that it was a really strong foundation that was done in the beginning by Yale University and the FBI, and then further enhanced tremendously by the Connecticut State Police and the New Haven Police Department. Had we not all worked pretty seamlessly from the beginning up until now, it would never have happened as quickly as it did. And then plus part of this too, which is part of it, is that, we had the forensic laboratory here in Connecticut that was working around the clock with us. And because of their analysis and everything that was done, we were able to put all of that into an arrest warrant.
I still find it incredible that Sunday you retrieve Annie's body, but by 3 or 4 days later, you've managed to get enough evidence to secure both a search warrant and an arrest thing. And you're dealing in some cases with well over 100 police officers working on this particular case from all kinds of different angles, from all kinds of things. And you kind of not only checking off the green pen, but also all kinds of other false leads. How do you keep an investigation like that focused and on track with so many different agencies, so many different people? Oh, and by the way, the media, and some of those, your own colleagues are leaking to the media and giving all kinds of nonsense like that. So how do you do that? Like, what's the internal and then both external process for you?
Oh, geez, that's a loaded question. So I'll start with a couple pieces of it. There was a lot of information being leaked, and we don't know the source of it, but it definitely was law enforcement leaking, whether it was New Haven PD, University PD, and oftentimes it was inaccurate, and that was actually hurting us a lot because information was getting out there. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, why would it hurt your investigation if there's inaccurate? I mean, who cares if the journalists are reporting something inaccurate? Surely.
Well, because by putting out misinformation, if there are any witnesses or anybody out there that has additional information, they're going to think I must be wrong, or why am I going to bother? They already have information. And so as much as we tried to control the information that was being released, we couldn't. And then unfortunately what had to happen is, gag orders went into play. We literally were stationed only out of the FBI headquarters. The only people that knew information were those that were incredibly intimate with the investigation, that we didn't share stuff intentionally. Like, I kept things from my boss, both the assistant chief of the New Haven Police Department and the chief of police in New Haven, because I didn't know where there was a leak, right? But I knew if I kept it from everybody other than, the handful of us that were working this case, then it was secure, that nobody was going to leak it. And if they did, then we had an issue with those closely involved in the investigation.
Which you didn't. It wasn't one of those close teams.
It wasn't,
somebody
no.
kind of on the fringes that was feeding this.
That were overhearing us speak, and so we literally had to stop doing that, which, is a whole other issue. I mean, you want to be able to speak freely, but we couldn't anymore. We would have to go to private rooms where there were only a handful of us in it and talk about it. And, it was just something we've never faced before, to be quite honest. I mean, you're always going to have people leaking information. They'll say, unofficial police sources. And so, i.e., somebody said something they shouldn't have said. And yet, we had to control that part of it. But to go back to, sometimes misinformation getting out, and how do we get all this information that everybody had to compile it into one arrest warrant? We actually wrote a timeline of things that we knew we needed to put into an arrest warrant to give us enough probable cause in order to arrest Raymond Clark, who was subsequently arrested and pled guilty to murdering Annie. And we all took turns authoring this affidavit, believe it or not. And we were operating, as you mentioned early on, about 21 hours a day on this case. We were sleeping at the FBI. We would go home, shower, change our suits, and head back in, literally. That's all we were doing. And we were taking naps. And so, we were tired. We were exhausted. And by this, we're now, I don't know how many days straight of this, your brain stops working. So by having all of us kind of sitting down and reviewing and editing and plugging in, oh, you forgot to do this. And, we were able to put it together and get a pretty incredibly detailed arrest warrant for the murder of Annie Legg.
Now, you arrest him. He spends the next year and a half denying, saying that he didn't do it. And then it goes to trial in March of 2011. What happened at that process?
So it actually never made it to trial. We were going through the process, obviously, as you can imagine, with any court case through the adjudication process, there's a series of steps that come in. Ray Clark basically accepts a plea deal to avoid the death penalty at that time, because it was still on the table, or life in prison because of the nature of the crimes he was arrested with. And he accepts a plea bargain for several charges that he was arrested for, with the possibility of no parole was also part of this whole thing. And so, he pled guilty, pleading the fifth, which is that there was enough information that we had that a reasonable person would believe that he was guilty. And he was sentenced.
Was there any sense, and he was sentenced to 44 years without parole in jail for this awful murder. Was there any sense of why he did it? Did you ever think about that or to talk about that?
No. So, there's always the why that we all try to do as investigators, but honestly, it didn't matter why he did it. Somebody was murdered, brutally murdered, left into a wall like a piece of trash. And why he did it, who cares? That investigative, that nagging, you rationalize, or you try to rationalize why somebody does something, and you never can understand it, because a reasonable, rational person doesn't go and kill somebody, brutally beats them, and then throws them into a wall.
And this program isn't about making excuses for somebody. This is such an awful thing to have done that, even discussing the why in this particular case, if he is not going to talk about it, may even start like, oh, I had an unhappy childhood or whatever.
It doesn't matter. Investigatively, it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that you killed somebody. Yeah. And you didn't just do it as a whim. You took time to conceal what you did for days. And one thing that's important in this case, that the lab wasn't locked down initially. So, it wasn't secure initially because we were treating it, I say we, because we are a collective we. We were treating it as a missing person case, not as a homicide. So Ray Clark came and went to work for days after he just killed somebody and hit her body in a wall, with no remorse, no anything, never was forthcoming, never said, hey, oops, guys, by the way, like nothing, was hoping he was going to get away with it, and hid evidence for days before we locked down that building.
What I find extraordinary about this is that you come in late to the investigation, or relatively late to investigation, that the crime scene's being tainted and tampered and all kinds of stuff. You're coming in on Saturday when the murder was done on Tuesday, but you're able to successfully wrap up. You're able to identify the culprit. You're able to do that in less than a week, in less than 5 days. Round the clock work and stuff. Let me ask you a strange question, because in preparation for this, I've talked to a lot of people and stuff. Lisa Dadio, your name is renowned here in New Haven. You're a bit of a celebrity detective in town. And a lot of young women want to know how you did it. Was it because... two questions. What is it like being a woman who was head of the major crimes unit? And B, did that help? Was there a perspective as a woman that helped you solve this murder mystery and other cases that you've worked on?
So, that's a little bit of a loaded question.
Of course, that's what I'm here for. That's my job. Ask loaded questions.
And I think it's great, because it's, women in general are a very low percentage of law enforcement throughout the country. It's a well-known researched fact. And And yet here I am in Connecticut running the major crime division, and I have 100 or so predominantly males working for me. I have male supervisors working for me. I report to a male assistant chief and a male chief, and yet I'm the only female that is in kind of like a command part of it. So for people who know me, they know me that I'm a no nonsense, direct type of person, because I had to be quite honest with you. I knew that I needed to, in a way, continue to prove myself, which I had done for 20 years while I was with New Haven Police Department, and not get emotionally tied up in this and handle it as if I would every other investigation that we had. I am thankful for the relationship that I had and continued to have with the people that worked for me, that respected me no matter what my gender was, and that we had a goal, we had a mission, and that was to solve this case, despite gender, race, ethnicities. And, you know, we did it. We did what we always had done before. Now, what I think helped in dealing with all the other agencies, with Yale University, the FBI, and the Connecticut State Police, is I don't have a perceived ego, even though some people will probably disagree with that. But, you know, I was able to not become cocky or arrogant, because it's not in my nature to do that. And kind of like, let's work together and get this to work. I wasn't looking to showboat. For years after this case, and even to this day now, I've been retired for 8 years out of New Haven. I still say that this is the case that kind of made me, and yet it wasn't my case alone. It was something that there were no egos when we worked together on this case. We all had one goal: to find the person responsible.
And I don't want to get all politically correct. You know me, I'm not that kind of guy. But is the implication that women have less of an ego, and that there's a lot of the showboating male egos? I see you nodding on that one. Go on.
I know. Well, yeah, because it's true. I mean, we all know. You never hear people refer to, oh, she's so cocky and arrogant. You don't hear that. We have other negative names that are given to females typically, right? But males, it's cocky and arrogant. But in a lot of circles, that's viewed as being positive. With women, it's not always viewed as that. Even 8 years out, you know, my confidence and my directness can be perceived as something differently because of my gender.
But in terms of managing a major crimes investigation with multiple different agencies, it's actually great. It's actually a great strength.
It worked.
Yeah.
It worked really, really well. And in fact, the relationships that I made with people at the federal level and the state level, my male counterparts, all males. There was a female special agent in charge who was amazing and was so supportive. And actually, you know, she was obviously leading the FBI. She was the SAC, they call it, SAC, the special agent in charge. And then there was me from New Haven, and yet working with an entire male command staff with the Connecticut State Police. And yet, you know what? There were no barriers. There were no issues. Everybody respected one another. There was no anything. It honestly was amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was bigger than that. It was bigger than my gender.
Awesome. Let me ask you another question, because, again, doing the research on this case, and a wry, ironic comment from an author or a writer saying, if you're going to be murdered, please have the decency to be a Harvard or Yale student. And that author was not making disparaging remarks about Annie Lay in any way, but it was the amount of attention that came to a Yale graduate student as opposed to a gangbanger or just somebody who happens to live in a poor neighborhood. Talk to us a little bit about those issues.
So, I mean, we dealt with those issues even internally, because New Haven is a violent city. I'm not saying anything that isn't true. It's been that way for decades. Per capita, you know, we're always ranked up there as being one of the most violent cities. And yet the resources that we had available to us for this case, we don't have for any other case. So while I never saw that comment previously, but we did talk about it earlier, it's true. I mean, the forensic lab was operating 24 hours a day. We had the Connecticut State Police, the FBI, the New Haven Police Department, and Yale University operating 24 hours a day just on this case. It doesn't get the attention of anywhere else. But one thing, too, to understand is this wasn't the first Yale student that was murdered in the city of New Haven. We've had a few over the years, and one of which is still unsolved, and that's the murder of Yale graduate student Suzanne Joven, which happened before Annie. And so there were issues with that, too, because there was concern that the New Haven Police Department wouldn't be able to solve yet another Yale student murder. And yet there was Suzanne Joven's, whose case is still unsolved and cold here in the Connecticut, So that kind of that mentality of go to an Ivy and then all these resources sadly is true. And I can't make an excuse for it. If it weren't for all the resources we had, would we have solved it? Yeah, looking back, because I know hindsight's 2020, right? So we had the person right away. This wasn't just a drive-by shooting and no witnesses. We had it locked down to a building that in a room. So all that stuff that we had early on, we would have still been able to do it. It just would have taken us much longer to do.
Lisa, I'd love to have you back on. Thank you so much for your work. This is only going out an audio. I wish our listeners had seen the expression on your face, because it's clear that this is a case that still moves you emotionally. When we were talking about Annie Lay and just, what an amazing person she had been and was. So thank you for at least bringing closure and solving this murder case in an incredibly short amount of time. And thanks for coming on Crime Waves.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Hey, it's Declan here on behalf of all the Crime Waves podcast team. That's Ryan Decker, Aidan Van Battenberg, and Eric Krebs. Thank you for listening to The Disappearance of Annie Lay with the lead investigator, Lisa Dadio. And we apologize again for the sound quality of the interview. But if you like the program, please, we ask you to do the usual social media stuff, like, subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It's all super appreciated. And join us next week for the first episode with the greatest forensic detective of our age, Dr. Henry C. Lee, and his investigation of the legendary American Indigenous leader, Pocahontas.